On December 7, 1941, Winston Churchill was positioned within his private study at Chequers, the official country estate of the Prime Minister. At the moment the intelligence arrived, the Imperial Japanese forces had struck Pearl Harbor. In later writings, he would confess that he retired to his bed that evening and slumbered with the deep rest of a man who felt rescued and filled with gratitude. Following a period of 2 years where Britain stood practically solitary in opposition to Nazi Germany, observing his metropolitan areas consumed by fire during the Blitz, and after endless pleading, persuading, and wishing for American interference, the event had finally occurred. The United States was entering the conflict. Yet Churchill grasped a truth that night which would require months to fully manifest. Understanding that America would fight was one matter. However, witnessing American soldiers upon British territory, marching through British thoroughfares, tangible and present, and prepared to battle alongside his weary nation, that would represent an entirely different reality. Since before the conflict commenced, Churchill had been wooing American participation. Serving as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1939, and subsequently as Prime Minister from May 1940 onwards, he dispatched missive after missive to President Franklin Roosevelt. The volume of correspondence was phenomenal, totaling over 1,700 distinct messages between them throughout the war years. Initially, Churchill subscribed his letters as "former naval person," an allusion to his previous Admiralty post, creating a tone of intimacy that circumvented standard diplomatic avenues. The connection was undeniably strategic, yet also emotional. His mother, born Jenny Jerome in Brooklyn, was American. He had always harbored a deep linkage to America, having traversed the nation and maintained friendships there. However, beyond personal affection, he comprehended precisely what Britain required. Following the capitulation of France in June 1940, Britain remained the sole resistance in Western Europe against Hitler. The Soviet Union was still tethered by its non-aggression pact with Germany. Churchill required America not merely as a provider of armaments and sustenance, but as a combat ally. The Lend-Lease Act, enacted by the United States Congress in March 1941, had served as a vital preservation line. American vessels delivered tanks, airplanes, munitions, and provisions. But ships and supplies were not infantry. They possessed no capacity to occupy terrain or assault beaches. Throughout 1941, as German divisions pushed deep into the Soviet Union following Hitler's invasion in June, Churchill observed and waited, hoping that some event would draw America into the hostilities. The attack on Pearl Harbor achieved what all his rhetorical skill had failed to accomplish. On December 8th, the United States formally declared war against Japan. 3 days subsequent to that, Germany and Italy issued declarations of war against the United States. Without delay, Churchill arranged to journey to Washington for a summit with Roosevelt. He reached his destination on December 22nd and remained through the turn of the new year, debating strategy, synchronizing plans, and constructing the alliance necessary to win the war. Nevertheless, strategic gatherings in Washington were theoretical. The genuine trial would commence when American soldiers arrived in Britain. The initial American units disembarked in Northern Ireland on January 26, 1942. These were advance elements, limited in number, the precursor to what would become a deluge. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, additional forces arrived. By the year's conclusion, more than 100,000 American service personnel were billeted in Britain. By the designated time of D-Day in June 1944, that figure would surpass 1.5 million. They traveled by ship, traversing the Atlantic in convoys, constantly vigilant for U-boats. They disembarked at Liverpool, at Belfast, and at various harbors surrounding the British Isles. They were youthful, the majority of them. Many had never ventured outside America previously. They discovered themselves in a nation that had been at war for over 2 years, a country scarred by rationing, bomb devastation, and fatigue. The British response to the Americans was intricate. There was authentic thankfulness. These men were arriving to assist, after all, to combat a mutual foe. However, there was also tension. The Americans appeared incredibly affluent by British standards. They received wages far superior to British soldiers. They had access to commodities that ordinary Britons had not witnessed for years. Their uniforms were of finer quality, their rations more plentiful. The American military provided its troops with luxuries that seemed nearly indecent to a populace subsisting on rations that had been reduced repeatedly. The renowned expression surfaced, "Overpaid, oversexed, and over here." It was uttered with humor, typically, but humor that possessed a sharp edge. British soldiers, paid a fraction of what Americans earned, watched American GIs escort British women to dances and public houses. British families, surviving on rations that permitted 4 ounces of bacon per person per week, heard reports of American mess halls serving steak and ice cream. Yet, beneath the friction lay something more profound: hope, relief, a sensation that the tide might genuinely reverse. Churchill experienced this more intensely than anyone. He comprehended the mathematics of the war. Germany had subjugated most of Europe. Its armies were immense, its industries manufacturing weapons at a prodigious rate. Britain was enduring, but enduring was not winning. The Soviet Union was absorbing the brunt of German military might, but the Eastern Front was distant, and the result was unsure. Britain needed America's industrial capacity, its seemingly infinite resources, its fresh battalions. He had witnessed the supply ships arriving, had tracked the figures, had authorized the blueprints for American bases and training facilities across Britain. But seeing the men themselves, observing them march in formation through British streets, that would make it real, in a manner that shipping manifests and strategic planning papers never could. The definitive moment arrived during a dreary afternoon in London. The specific calendar date is of less consequence than what the event symbolized. American troops were being transported through the metropolis, a significant contingent marching in formation from one station to another. These were not the first Americans Churchill had encountered in Britain by this juncture. Months into 1942, American soldiers were a frequent sight. However, this was distinct. This was a formal procession through the heart of London, through streets that had been bombed during the Blitz, past structures that still displayed damage from German raids. Churchill ensured he was present. He positioned himself where he could observe them pass. His staff knew better than to intervene when the Prime Minister desired to witness something personally. They arranged for him to have an unobstructed view, a location where he could stand and watch without causing excessive disruption. The Americans approached marching in columns, their boots impacting the pavement in rhythm. They wore their uniforms, their helmets, and carried their rifles. They were young men, most of them 18, 19, 20 years of age. Farm boys from Iowa, factory laborers from Detroit, clerks from New York. They had trained in camps across America, had crossed the Atlantic in crowded troop transports, and had arrived in a country at war. They marched with the specific bearing of American soldiers, perhaps less rigid than British troops, but confident. They knew they were part of something immense. They had grown up hearing about the Great War, about American doughboys going over there to fight in France. Now they were doing the identical thing, following in those footsteps, coming to Europe to fight another German war. London crowds assembled to watch them pass. Office personnel emerged from buildings. Shopkeepers stood in doorways. People lined the sidewalks. Some applauded, some waved. Children called out to them. The Americans grinned, waved back, and maintained their formation. Churchill watched in silence initially. His eyes traveled along the columns, absorbing the sight. His face, usually so expressive, was difficult to interpret. Those who stood near him later reported that his eyes were moist. He had spent 2 years carrying the weight of Britain's survival. 2 years of delivering speeches, rallying the nation, making desperate decisions about where to dispatch limited resources. 2 years of watching young British men depart to fight in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, in the air over Germany. 2 years of reading casualty reports, of visiting bombed cities, of knowing that Britain was stretched to its absolute limit. And now, here were the Americans. Thousands of them, with thousands more incoming. An entire nation's military power being deployed to Britain, preparing to take the fight to Hitler's Europe. Someone near Churchill asked him what he thought. The Prime Minister was silent for a moment, still watching the marching troops. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the emotion of those 2 years of standing alone. "When I behold these young men," he declared, "I know we are going to triumph in this war." It was a simple assertion, but it carried enormous magnitude. Churchill was not prone to simple optimism. He understood the realities of modern warfare, understood how arduous the road ahead would be. The invasion of France was still 2 years distant. The Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats was at its peak. The war in North Africa was undecided. The Soviets were locked in a desperate struggle at Stalingrad. But seeing the Americans march through London, seeing the physical manifestation of American commitment, Churchill allowed himself to believe in victory not merely as a possibility, but as an inevitability. He elaborated, speaking to those around him, his words tumbling out in that characteristic Churchillian manner, phrases building upon phrases. "They are so young, so strong, so confident," he said, watching another column pass. "Look at them. They have come 3,000 miles to assist us. They have come to fight for freedom, for civilization, for everything we have been defending." His voice grew more robust. "Hitler's made his greatest error. He thought America would remain neutral, would stay out of Europe's wars. He thought Britain would fall or surrender. He thought wrongly on both counts. Now he faces not just Britain, not just Russia, but America as well. The greatest industrial power on earth, the greatest reserve of manpower, all of it now committed to his destruction." Churchill paused, retrieving his handkerchief to wipe his eyes. He was not embarrassed by the tears. "I have waited so long for this," he said quietly. "So long." The people around him understood. They had lived through the same years, the same fears. The summer of 1940, when invasion seemed imminent. The Blitz, when London burned night after night. The losses at sea. The U-boats sinking ship after ship. The defeats in France, in Greece, in Crete. The desperate holding action in North Africa. The constant question, how long can we endure? The Americans represented the answer. Not just military power, though that was crucial. They represented the vindication of everything Churchill had argued for, everything he had worked toward. His courtship of Roosevelt, his speeches about Anglo-American partnership, his belief that the English-speaking peoples would stand together, all of it was being proven correct in the most tangible way possible. As the procession continued, Churchill's mood shifted from emotional to analytical. He began pointing out details to his staff. "Notice their equipment," he said. "Modern, well-made. They have the industrial capacity to equip millions of men like this. Millions." He watched their faces. They are eager. They want to fight. That eagerness will cost some of them their lives, but it will also carry them through things that tired men cannot do. He was already thinking ahead, planning how to utilize this American energy, how to coordinate British experience with American strength. "We must train them properly," he said. "They are brave but inexperienced. We have been fighting for 2 years. We know things they do not know yet. We must teach them what we have learned, and we must learn from them as well." Someone mentioned the friction between British and American troops, the complaints about pay differences and American abundance. Churchill waved it away impatiently. "Of course there is friction. Put any 2 groups of young men together and there will be friction. But they are on our side. That is what matters. They are here. They are real. And they are going to help us win." The march lasted over an hour, column after column of American soldiers passing through London. Churchill stayed for the entirety of it, watching until the last troops had passed by. He seemed reluctant to depart, as if the sight was sustaining him, feeding something he had been running on empty for too long. When it was finally concluded, he turned to his staff. "I want to meet some of them," he said. "Arrange for me to visit an American base. I want to talk to these young men. I want to thank them personally." The visits were arranged over the following months. Churchill made a point of visiting American units stationed in Britain. He would arrive unannounced sometimes, or with minimal warning, wanting to see the troops as they actually were, not dressed up for a formal inspection. He would walk through their camps, talk to small groups, ask them where they were from, what they thought of Britain, whether they were being treated well. The American soldiers were often startled to find the British Prime Minister suddenly in their midst. Churchill was instantly recognizable. The rotund figure, the bulldog face, the ever-present cigar. He would shake hands, make jokes, ask questions. He wanted them to know they were appreciated, wanted them to understand what their presence meant to Britain. In one camp, he found a group of soldiers from Texas. "Texas!" he exclaimed. "I've been to Texas. A wonderful state, vast and full of energy. You Texans are known for your fighting spirit. We shall need that spirit in the days ahead." The soldiers grinned, pleased that this famous British leader knew something about their home. At another base, he encountered soldiers who had just arrived, who were still processing the reality of being in Britain. "You have come a long way," Churchill told them. "You have left your homes, your families, everything familiar. You have come to a country that has been at war for over 2 years, that is tired and worn. But I tell you this, your arrival has lifted our spirits more than you can possibly know. When we see you, we see hope. We see strength. We see victory." He meant every word. Churchill understood symbolism, understood the power of morale. But this wasn't just symbolism. The Americans were real military power, real divisions that could be deployed, real air squadrons that could bomb German cities, real ships that could protect convoys. The strategic implications were enormous. Churchill and his military chiefs began planning operations that would have been impossible before American entry. North Africa could be reinforced. An invasion of Italy could be contemplated, and eventually the great invasion of France could be planned. Operation Overlord, D-Day, the massive amphibious assault that would require American troops, American landing craft, American air power, American everything. But in that moment, watching the Americans march through London, Churchill wasn't thinking about specific operations. He was thinking about what it meant that these men were here at all. For 2 years, Britain had fought on, but always with the question hanging over everything. Can we actually win? Can we defeat Germany? Or are we just postponing the inevitable? The Americans answered that question. Yes, Britain could win. Not alone, but with allies. With American industrial might and Soviet manpower and British determination, yes, Germany could be defeated. Churchill had said in his famous speech after Dunkirk in June 1940, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." It was magnificent defiance, but defiance based on will, not certainty. Now, watching the Americans march through London, he could add a new certainty. And we shall win. The relationship between British and American forces would have its challenges. There were disagreements about strategy. Churchill wanted to attack Germany through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, through Italy and the Balkans. The Americans, particularly General George Marshall, wanted a direct assault across the Channel into France. There were tensions about command structures, about who would lead combined operations. There were the inevitable cultural clashes between British and American soldiers. But beneath all of that was the fundamental reality that Churchill grasped that day, watching the march. America was in the war, fully committed, and that changed everything. The young men marching through London that day would fight in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, in Germany itself. Many of them would die. American casualties in the European theater would exceed 300,000, with over 100,000 dead. They would fight at places whose names would become legendary: Omaha Beach, the Bulge, the Hurtgen Forest, the Rhine Crossing. But they would win. Alongside British, Canadian, French, Polish, and other Allied forces, alongside the massive Soviet armies grinding forward from the east, the Americans would help crush Nazi Germany. The war would last another 3 years after that march through London. 3 years of brutal fighting. But the outcome, from the moment America fully committed, was ultimately decided. Churchill knew this, standing there watching the Americans pass. He knew it. The emotion he felt, the tears in his eyes, came from relief as much as joy. Relief that the burden would be shared. Relief that Britain would not have to stand alone anymore. Relief that victory was now possible, not just as a desperate hope, but as a realistic goal. In his memoirs, written after the war, Churchill would return again and again to the theme of Anglo-American partnership. He would write about the special relationship between Britain and America, would argue for maintaining close ties in the post-war world. Some of this was strategic calculation. Britain would need American support in the Cold War that followed. But some of it was genuine feeling, born in those dark years when American help meant the difference between survival and defeat. The march through London was not the first time Churchill saw American troops in Britain, and it would not be the last. But it represented something crucial, the moment when American involvement became real and visible, when the alliance moved from diplomatic agreements and shipping manifests to actual soldiers marching through British streets. Churchill had spent 2 years holding Britain together through force of will and eloquence. He had given speeches that rallied the nation, had made decisions that kept Britain in the fight, had worked tirelessly to build the alliance that would win the war. But will and eloquence could only do so much. At some point, you needed armies, needed soldiers, needed the physical power to fight back. The Americans brought that power, and watching them march through London, Churchill allowed himself to believe fully, for perhaps the first time since becoming Prime Minister in May 1940, that Britain would not just survive, but would win. "When I see these young men," he had said, "I know we are going to win this war." It was not a boast. It was not propaganda. It was a statement of fact, spoken by a man who had carried the weight of Britain's survival for 2 years, and who could finally, watching those American soldiers march past, set that weight down and share it with allies who had the strength to help carry it. The war would grind on. There would be setbacks and losses, difficult decisions, and terrible casualties. But the fundamental equation had changed. Germany now confronted not merely the defiance of Britain, but the might of America. And that, Churchill knew, watching those young Americans march through London streets, would make all the difference.